today is speaking and listening. But of course we never speak, or never talk, except to some purpose. And we very rarely carry out speaking and listening on our own. And nor is it possible for everyone to say what they want at any time. For example, at this moment, the convention is that I talk and you listen. So my theme today really, and the way I want to take things is, I want to argue against the way that speaking and listening is often presented, if you like, as individualized skills or competences. I think this perspective has been sort of emphasized in recent years by sort of current assessment regimes, which grade learners at kind of different levels of ability or competence. For example, looking at the early learning goals, the national curriculum statements, the AL stages. There's no harm in knowing where people stand at the moment. The problem comes when we kind of rave by these standards and think of people as having fixed levels. In contrast, in my session this afternoon, I'm wanting to focus on speaking and listening as a social and collective practice, rather than as a neutral skill. I want to look at learning as socially situated, rather than as individual internal development. I want to present a view of speaking and listening, or talk, following, I suppose, Leyven Wenger in their quite famous book, which they call socially situated practice. And when I'm talking about speaking, listening, being situated, I'm not just talking about in the way that G talks about it as talks situated in academic practices, but actually situated in a whole nexus of social relationships, and indeed situated in a whole nexus of ideologies around ability. I'm wanting this afternoon to explore the processes by which students learn to become members of different communities of practice. From this perspective, the learning's about social participation in the practices of different societal communities, participation which the learner's also active in constructing, and the learner's also active in constructing identities within those practices and within those communities. Because we all belong to a number of different communities, each with their own practices, our family, our work, school, interest groups, and at a larger level, cultural groupings. Each develops its own routines, rules, conventions, histories, and ways of judging. These communities of practice are so much a part of our lives, they become so familiar that we often take the processes completely for granted. But for me, an important part of pedagogy is about becoming aware of how these practices operate and making the ground rules, as Neil Mercer calls them, of these valued practices explicit and transparent in order for learners to succeed. So I'm interested in how learners in multilingual, multi-ethnic classrooms come to be positioned as either competent or incompetent members of that community of practice, the community of practice which is a school, and what it is that they might be learning when they're not learning what we wanted them to learn, as George Kelly's put it. I want to look at how this positioning takes place through interactions in the classroom, and how speaking and listening practices in particular play an important role in this construction of differential levels of ability. I've recently finished an ESRC research study on secondary school English classrooms in collaboration with colleagues at the University of London Institute of Education and Keele University. What was striking in that project was the way in which, for all the teachers in the 3 schools and 9 classrooms that we worked with, differential ability was a taken-for-granted concept on which they based their organisational arrangements of the classrooms. Of course, this oughtn't to be surprising in English society. We operate day to day with a common sense concept of ability, say things like, he's a bright kid, she's got a talent for it, he's got the right brains for it. It runs in the family. And my topic today, unexpectedly, is suddenly very relevant in view of the Prince of Wales comments and the discussion earlier this week. I think, this week it's quite clear that people are still working very closely with this notion that there may be limitations in terms of natural levels of ability for most people, that we can pigeonhole people. And we do find the same assumption of fixed innate ability still embedded in the discourse of our primary schools, for example, school statements of aims, which read, in this school we try to meet each child's needs according to their age and ability. That assumption's always there. But how do we know what a child's ability or their potential is? What's the ceiling? When we talk of slow learners or gifted and talented children, the very able, there's even a new category I find of the moderately able. While the able in some cases mean those, and I quote, those who succeed age-related expectations, we also speak of those who are, quote, underachieving although able. There's a common assumption here of some underlying ability, intelligence or potential which is somehow fixed and inbuilt. Of course, this idea has had a long history, running right back to the 19th century at least, when problematizing of social hierarchies of by birth, whether people were born rich or poor, was replaced by social Darwinism, and a new so-called scientific hierarchy of intelligence which ensured continuity, in fact, in the social order by favouring the upper and middle classes. Up until comparatively recently, intelligence testing provided what was seen as a technically neutral tool for allocating and targeting limited resources to a selected group of children. Tests were claimed to assess children's suitability for different programs in different types of school. And for those of you who are too young to remember, but I think for all of us, just to remember how this was done, I want to just show a very short piece of video. My colleague will do it. I'm grateful to Michael Poole, director of a recent BBC programme on the rise and sprawl of the middle classes, for this very, very short piece of video. Are we ready for it? Okay?
Sorry, Janet failed the 11th class.
Well, I hardly think that failed is the right word, Mrs. Kitchen. You see, what happened was that Janet took a test so that we could find out exactly which school would suit her best. She would have failed the test had she been selected for the wrong school. And therefore, if she's been selected for the right school, then she's really passed the test.
Kindly, many parents and children were told that little was expected of them. The energy and persistence that over the years that has gone into convincing children that after all they're not very clever, that the best they can hope for is to be good and obedient and not to achieve academically. While of course these tests are largely discredited, and I say largely discredited because in some senses they may re-emerge as a means of selection, this assumption of fixed and differential levels of ability has lingered on. This can be seen in the rhetoric of meeting each child's needs according to their ability, but also in these very powerful, the way the powerful national and teacher assessments lead to grouping arrangements in school. And these sort of unexamined concepts of ability have led to forms of differentiation that I think Jenny Hammond from Australia has very significantly called dumbing down rather than supporting up. Once allocated to groups, to ability groups, children have tended to be given differential tasks with expectations of different levels of outcome. Children tend not to be shifted from group to group, so once allocated to the bottom or top group, they receive different tasks, different levels of feedback, and the gap between the top and bottom group widens and widens, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. In particular, increasing evidence seems to show that early stage EAL learners are being placed in low ability sets, and consequently exposed to particular types of speaking and listening, which I shall argue takes place in those so-called low ability sets. So in my session I want to examine the effects of this assumption of fixed and differential levels of ability on the sort of talk that takes place in multi-ethnic classrooms. Once we change focus and see speaking and listening as social and collective practice, it raises new questions. If learning is a sort of apprenticeship into new practices, what are the valued academic practices that we want to introduce children to? How do these practices relate to the school practices of speaking and listening? How do the speaking and listening practices position learners, and do they position learners differently? So I'm going to call on some of the evidence collected in the ESRC project on the production of school English to show some of the ways, very subtle ways, in which different levels of ability are constructed for and with different students in our multi-ethnic classrooms. But before I get into that, I want to start my session this afternoon by making the familiar our UK classrooms strange by considering how speaking and listening position learners in other classrooms in different parts of the world. So I shall be using some examples, video examples from Japan, Botswana, and showing an example from Russia. Because I want us to consider what sort of community of practice our schools construct for learners and the implications for the sort of speaking and listening that take place there. What's made explicit in our classrooms and for whom? Finally, drawing on work carried out by colleagues on work-based apprenticeships, I want to try out with this afternoon's session a first draft of a framework for analysis for pedagogical approaches along a continuum from those that are more restrictive or narrow, reified, limited and short-term, to those which are more expansive, offering opportunities to link school-based learning to out-of-school knowledges, to extend identities, to reflect on and to explore new understanding.